Close your eyes and let all the stress of today's world fade away. Let the noise from computers and phones get quieter. The bright light from screens goes dark. You're floating backward in time now, not just a few years, but thousands and thousands of years. 6,000 years melt away like fog in the morning, and you're standing at the very beginning of written history, where old stories and memories mix together into something deep and mysterious. Before you is an endless black space, the empty darkness that existed before anything was created. This isn't just the story of what the Anunnaki did when they came to Earth. This is the story of what happened before that, the missing parts, the forgotten beginning. What happened in space before those beings came down from the sky? What was their world like when it was perfect? And what terrible disaster made them look for safety among the stars? The Sumerian writings whisper these secrets, hidden in triangle-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets over 4,000 years ago. Tonight, we will figure out what those whispers mean. We will travel to a time before time, to a place before places existed, and learn what the oldest written words in human history tell us about the space drama that happened before we were created. Before we go deeper, hit that like button and get ready for amazing discoveries. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. And like always with our videos, the pictures help explain things, but you don't need them to follow along. Thank you for always supporting us. Get ready and let's jump in. The story starts not with arrival, but with nothing being there. Not with the Anunnaki standing proud on Earth's ground, but with the huge, scary emptiness that existed before anything at all. The Sumerian writings, especially those creation stories saved on clay tablets found at Nippur, Eridu, tell us about a time that came even before the gods themselves. This is the big mystery at the center of Mesopotamian space beliefs. The gods, these powerful beings who would later come down to build civilizations and create humans, were not forever. They were not the beginning. They also had a start. And understanding that start is the key to understanding everything that comes next. The oldest Sumerian writings describe this beginning state with a word that gives chills to anyone who really thinks about it. Namu, also written as Nama in some translations. She was not a goddess like we usually think of gods. She was something much more basic, much more scary. Namu was the first ocean, the space sea that existed before heaven and earth were separated. Before the first light broke through the darkness, before existence as we understand it had any shape at all. Picture it, not water like we know it, flowing in rivers or crashing in waves on a beach. This was something completely different. The Sumerians thought of Namu as a huge, unmixed space of possibilities, an endless dark sea that filled all space, held all possibilities, but showed up as nothing. It was chaos in its purest form, not the messy disorder of a dirty room or a wild storm, but original chaos, the state of pure possibility before any organizing rule had put structure on reality. The tablets tell us that Namu existed by herself, needing no creator, having no beginning. She simply was. And inside her dark waters, sleeping, waiting, were the seeds of everything that would ever exist. This space ocean was both womb and grave, both creative force and destructive empty space. Modern scholars studying these ancient writings note that the Sumerian idea of Namu represents one of humanity's earliest attempts to deal with the thinking problem of creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing. But the Sumerians rejected that idea completely. For them, there was no creation from nothing. There was only change, separation, the appearance of form from formlessness. Namu was that formlessness, and from her dark depths, something stirred. The writings describe the first act of creation not as a violent explosion or a divine command, but as a slow, natural emergence. From the waters of Namu came forth two beings, twin aspects of the first separation of reality, the earth goddess Ki and the sky god En. Their names are deceivingly simple. Ki means earth, and means heaven. But these were not the earth and heaven as we know them. These were space principles, the first separation of the unified emptiness into distinct realms. And was the dome of the sky, not blue and filled with clouds, but the dark ceiling of the heavens dotted with stars, a solid boundary that held back the space waters above. Ki was the foundation, the bedrock of reality, the solid ground on which all future existence would be built. Together they represented the first great space split, the original act that set all of creation in motion. The separation of above and below, of sky and earth, of male and female principle. Some versions of the myth suggest that En and Ki were originally joined together, a single unified mass floating in the dark waters of Namu, and that they were forcibly separated by a third figure, Enlil, the god of wind and air. But the older writings suggest something different. They hint that En and Ki emerged already separate, that their very existence was based on difference, on opposition, on the creative tension between sky and earth. This separation was not an act of violence, but an act of love, a space dance that would echo through all of Mesopotamian mythology. For you see, En and Ki did not remain separate. They came together in the first sacred marriage, the Hieros Gamos, the divine coupling that would become the template for all future creation. And from their union, the first generation of gods was born. Before we can understand what happened on the Anunnaki's home world, we must first understand who the Anunnaki actually were. The name itself is crucial. In the Sumerian language, Anunnaki, sometimes written as Anunna, can be translated in several ways. The most common academic translation is princely offspring or those of royal blood, coming from the god and whose name means heaven, and the word Nuna, which carries meanings of nobility and princely status. This immediately tells us something vital. The Anunnaki were not generic gods. They were specifically the children, the lineage, the royal family of the supreme sky god, and they were divine aristocracy, beings of privilege and power who traced their ancestry directly back to the source of all creation. The writings preserved at the ancient city of Eridu, the oldest city in Sumerian tradition, provide us with a genealogy, a divine family tree that maps out the emergence of the gods from that first space union of En and Ki. And it is here, in these genealogies, that we find our first clues about what existed before the Anunnaki came to Earth. From En and Ki came three mighty deities who would form the core of the Sumerian pantheon. First was Enlil, the god of wind, air, and storms, whose name means Lord Air. Enlil was the executive of the cosmos, the enforcer of divine law, the great separator who completed the work begun by his parents by further dividing heaven and earth, creating the space, the air, the atmosphere in which life could exist. Second was Enki, sometimes called Ea in later Akkadian texts, the god of the deep waters, of wisdom, of magic, of crafts and creation. His domain was the Abzu, the underground ocean of fresh water that the Sumerians believed existed deep beneath the earth, the mirror image of Namu's space sea above. Third, though her position in the genealogy is complex and sometimes contradictory, was Ninhursag, the great mother goddess, the deity of fertility, of mountains, of the earth's creative power. She was known by many names, Ki being one of them, suggesting that in some traditions she was identified with the original earth itself, while in others she was the daughter of Ki. These three, along with and who remained supreme in the heavens, formed what scholars call the great gods, the ruling council of the cosmos. But they were not alone. The writings speak of many other deities born from that first generation. Gods and goddesses who controlled every aspect of the natural world. Nana, the moon god whose silver light guided travelers and marked the months. Utu, the sun god whose daily journey across the sky brought warmth and justice. For he was also the god who saw all deeds, both good and evil, committed under his illuminating gaze. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, the morning and evening star, whose dual nature as both nurturing and destructive made her perhaps the most complex deity in the entire pantheon. She was the goddess who descended into the underworld and returned, who stole the me from Enki while he was drunk, who brought both pleasure and suffering to mortals and gods alike. Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, the dark counterpart to the bright gods above, ruling over the land of no return, where all souls eventually descended. Nergal, god of plague and war, who would later become her consort after forcing his way into the underworld. Ninurta, god of agriculture and hunting, the warrior deity who protected civilization from the forces of chaos. The list goes on. Each deity with specific domains, specific temples, specific roles in the space order. By some counts, there were 50 major Anunnaki gods. By others, there were hundreds. One writing from Eridu specifically mentions the 50 Anunnaki of Eridu, suggesting that each major city had its own contingent of divine beings, its own local pantheon nested within the greater hierarchy. The Sumerians thought of the cosmos as a three-tiered structure, a space architecture that defined the domains of the gods. At the top was the heaven, the domain of the sky god, a realm of pure authority where divine law originated. This was not the atmosphere or the blue sky humans could see, but a higher realm, perhaps multiple heavens stacked one above another, each more remote and more sacred than the last. In the middle was the key, the earth, the solid ground where humans and gods coexisted, where temples rose and cities sprawled, where agriculture sustained life. But beneath the earth lay the third realm, the Abzu, the space underground ocean of fresh water. This was Enki's domain, a mysterious realm of infinite depth, the source of all springs and rivers, the foundation upon which the visible world rested. The Abzu was not merely underground water in a geological sense. It was a space principle, the deep, the hidden, the source of wisdom and magic. Some writings describe it as containing Enki's temple, Abzu, House of the Abzu, where he resided with his wife Damkina, and where he performed his great works of creation and craft. And beneath even the Abzu, in some versions of Sumerian cosmology, lay the Kur, the underworld proper, the land of the dead, a dark realm where the sun traveled during the night, where Ereshkigal held court over the spirits of the deceased. This three-tiered cosmos, heaven, earth, and underworld, with the Abzu as a transitional zone between the living and the dead, structured all Sumerian religious thought. Each realm had its rulers, its laws, its inhabitants, and the boundaries between them, while normally stable, could be crossed under certain circumstances, often with terrible consequences. These were the Anunnaki, the royal family, the divine bureaucracy, the space government. And according to the writings, they did not simply exist in some abstract heavenly realm. They were active, involved, almost frighteningly tangible beings who had specific roles, specific dwellings, specific responsibilities. The gods lived in temples, literal physical structures built by human hands, but conceived as divine houses, where the deity actually resided. The god's statue, ornately carved and adorned with precious materials, was not merely a symbol, but was treated as the living presence of the deity. Priests would wake the god each morning, dress the statue, offer it food and drink, perform rituals to maintain the god's favor. This was not symbolic worship. This was practical service to a powerful being who was understood to be genuinely present in the temple, observing, judging, responding to offerings and prayers. But here is where the writings take a darker turn. For they tell us that before these gods could shape the world, before they could create humanity, before they could establish cities and civilizations, they themselves had to endure a period of terrible hardship and labor. This is perhaps the most surprising and humanizing element of Sumerian mythology. The gods were not all-powerful, effortless beings who created with a thought or a word. They had to work. They had to toil. They had to dig and build and sweat. They experienced exhaustion, frustration, pain. They were powerful, yes, vastly more powerful than humans, but they were not infinite in their power. They had limits. They had needs. They could suffer. And in this divine labor, in this space construction project that consumed thousands of years, we find the first hints of what may have happened on their original world before they ever turned their attention to Earth. We find the suggestion that the Anunnaki were not creating for pleasure or artistic expression, but out of desperate necessity, that they were refugees engaged in a massive terraforming operation, preparing a new home because their old one had failed them. The writing known as the Atrahasis epic, one of the most important Mesopotamian creation myths, provides the most detailed account of this divine labor crisis. The epic, preserved on tablets dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE, but clearly based on much older Sumerian traditions, begins with a startling premise. Before humanity existed, the gods themselves had to do all the work of creating and maintaining the world. And this work was backbreaking, endless, and deeply resented by those forced to perform it. The writing tells us that there was a hierarchy among the Anunnaki. At the top were the great gods, the ruling council, and in the heavens, Enlil commanding the earth and atmosphere, Enki overseeing the waters below. But below them was a vast workforce of lesser deities called the Igigi. The relationship between the Anunnaki and the Ijiji is complex and sometimes contradictory in the writings. In some versions, the Ijiji seem to be a separate class of younger gods. In others, they appear to be a subclass of the Anunnaki themselves, the divine proletariat, the workers whose labor sustained the space order. The Atrahasis epic tells us that for 3,600 years, the writing is very specific about this number, the Ijiji gods were forced to do the hard work of creation. They dug out the beds of the great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. They carved irrigation canals. They piled up mountains. They performed the fundamental terraforming operations that would make the land suitable for life. And they hated every moment of it. The writing is remarkably vivid in its description of their suffering. When the gods like men bore the work and suffered the toil of the gods was great. The work was heavy, the distress was much. Day after day, year after year, century after century, they toiled in the earth, and their resentment grew. This paints a picture that is startlingly different from most creation myths. This is not a serene process of divine will manifesting reality. This is hard physical labor. This is sweat and strain and exhaustion. The gods are not omnipotent beings speaking worlds into existence. They are workers, laborers, engineers engaged in a massive construction project that takes millennia to complete. And then, after 3,600 years, the Ijiji could take it no more. The Atrahasis epic describes what happened next in language that sounds less like mythology and more like a historical account of a labor revolt. The Ijiji gods burned their tools. They gathered together in the night, their faces grim, their hearts full of rage. They marched to the house of Enlil, the chief god who had assigned them this endless labor. They surrounded his dwelling, and they demanded an end to their torment. This is one of the most dramatic scenes in all of Mesopotamian literature. The great god Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, commander of the cosmos, is besieged in his own house by an angry mob of divine workers. The writing tells us that Enlil was terrified. He bolted his door. He sent his vizier to find out what was happening. And when he learned that the gods had rebelled against their working conditions, he did what any manager faced with a labor crisis would do. He called an emergency meeting of the board of directors, and was summoned from the heavens. Enki was called up from the depths. The great gods convened in council to address the revolt. And here the writing provides us with actual dialogue, actual speeches that give voice to the complaints of the divine workers. A spokesman for the Ijiji addressed the council, and his words carry a weight that resonates across millennia. Every single one of us gods has declared war. We have put a stop to the digging. The load is excessive. It is killing us. Our work is too hard, the trouble too much. This is not abstract mythology. This is a very specific grievance. The work is too hard. The conditions are intolerable. Something must change. Enlil's first response was rage. How dare these lesser gods defy the divine order? How dare they burn their tools and cease their work? He declared that he would destroy them all, that he would find the ringleaders and make an example of them. But Enki, the wise god of the waters, spoke with a different voice. Enki was always portrayed in Sumerian mythology as the clever one, the problem solver, the deity who could see solutions that others missed. And now, faced with this space labor crisis, he proposed something revolutionary. Why should we blame them? Enki asked the council. Their work was indeed too hard. Their trouble was too much. Every day the earth cried out. Why should we hear their clamor? And then he offered his solution. Let us create a primitive worker. Let him bear the yoke. Let man carry the toil of the gods. This is it. This is the moment. The decision that would lead to the creation of humanity. But before we can understand why this decision was made, we must ask a deeper question. Why were the gods doing this work in the first place? What were they building? Why was the labor so intense, so demanding, so precisely measured in that specific span of 3,600 years? Some scholars see this simply as a mythological explanation for the existence of humanity. We exist because the gods needed servants. It's a cynical but straightforward reading. But others, particularly those who take a more literal approach to these writings, see something else. They see a description of an actual construction project, a vast planet-wide terraforming operation that required massive labor, precise engineering, and the movement of unimaginable quantities of earth and water. They see evidence that the gods, the Anunnaki, were preparing Earth for a specific purpose. And they note that the time frame given 3,600 years appears again and again in Sumerian writings, always associated with space cycles, with the return of celestial bodies, with the orbital periods of distant worlds. Is it possible that the gods were not originally from this world at all? That they came from somewhere else, from a world that had its own orbital period, its own space clock? That they were, in essence, colonists sent ahead to prepare a new world for settlement, and that Earth was not their first home but their refuge? To understand what might have driven the Anunnaki to Earth, we must turn to the writings that describe not just the aftermath of their arrival, but hints, fleeting and fragmentary, of what came before. The problem is that the Sumerians did not write comprehensive histories in the way we might hope. Their writings are often literary, poetic, focused on specific events or moral lessons rather than broad narratives. But if we read carefully, if we piece together fragments from multiple sources, a picture begins to emerge. A picture of a world that once was. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, composed around 1200 BCE but drawing on much older Sumerian traditions, provides our most detailed account of the space circumstances that preceded the ordered world. While it is later than the pure Sumerian writings, it preserves and elaborates on themes that can be traced back to the earliest Mesopotamian writings. The epic begins with a description of the original state. When on high heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, naught but primordial Apsu, their begetter, and Mummu Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. Apsu, the male deity of fresh water. Tiamat, the female deity of salt water, the original ocean. And Mummu, a mysterious third entity, sometimes translated as mist or primordial form, perhaps representing the boundary between them. These three existed before creation, before the gods, before anything. They were the raw material of existence, the fundamental forces from which all else would emerge. The writing tells us that Apsu and Tiamat's waters mingled together, and from their union gods were born. First Lamu and Lahamu, deities of silt and mud. Then Anshar and Kishar, gods of the horizon, the circular boundary where heaven meets earth. And from them Anu, the god of heaven. And from Anu, Ea, the Sumerian Enki, god of wisdom and the deep. But as these younger gods were born and grew in number, they became a problem. The writing is explicit about this. The divine brothers banded together. They disturbed Tiamat as they surged back and forth. They were troubling the belly of Tiamat by their hilarity in the abode of heaven. Apsu could not lessen their clamor, and Tiamat was speechless at their ways. Their doings were loathsome, offensive, and overbearing were their ways. Here we see a theme that will repeat throughout Mesopotamian mythology. The younger generation of gods is noisy, disruptive, troublesome. They disturb the ancient order. They break the original silence. And the older generation, Apsu and Tiamat, find this intolerable. Apsu complains to Tiamat, "Their ways are verily loathsome unto me. By day I find no relief, nor repose by night. I will destroy, I will wreck their ways, that quiet may be restored. Let us have rest." This is extraordinary. The original father, the source of all the gods, is proposing genocide. He wants to destroy his own offspring because they make too much noise, because they disturb his rest. It's a remarkably petty motivation for space violence. And yet, it carries a profound truth. The old order cannot tolerate the new. The ancient powers cannot adapt to change. And so they seek to destroy what threatens their peace. Tiamat, in this early part of the story, is portrayed as reluctant. What? Should we destroy that which we have built? Their ways indeed are most troublesome, but let us attend kindly. She is the mother, unwilling to harm her children, even when they annoy her. But Apsu, with the counsel of his vizier Mummu, decides to act. He will destroy the younger gods. He will wipe them out and restore silence to the cosmos. But the younger gods, clever and resourceful, learn of Apsu's plan. And here Ea, the Sumerian Enki, performs the first great deed that will establish him as the hero and protector of his generation. Using his magic, his wisdom, his mastery of spells and incantations, Ea puts Apsu into a deep sleep, and then, while the original father slumbers, Ea kills him. He strips Apsu of his crown, removes his aura of divine power, and takes it for himself. Then he establishes his own dwelling place upon Apsu's corpse, upon the original fresh waters, the Abzu, which will now be Ea's domain. This is not a minor plot point. This is the murder of the Space Father, the overthrow of the original order, the younger generation asserting its dominance over the old. And it has consequences, terrible consequences. For while Tiamat was willing to tolerate her troublesome children when they merely disturbed her rest, she cannot tolerate the murder of her consort. The other gods come to her. They whisper in her ear. They tell her she should avenge Apsu. They remind her of his death. And something in Tiamat changes. The reluctant mother becomes the vengeful dragon. She transforms. The writing tells us that Tiamat took on a form monstrous and fearful. She creates an army 11 monstrous beings, creatures of nightmare and chaos. Demons with venom instead of blood, mad dogs, scorpion men, storm demons, fish men, creatures that blur the boundaries between species, between order and chaos. And she places at the head of her army a figure named Kingu, making him her new consort, elevating him to divine leadership, and giving him the Tablet of Destinies, the ultimate symbol of space authority. Now the younger gods face annihilation. Tiamat, transformed into a dragon of chaos leading an army of monsters, is coming to destroy them all. They are paralyzed with fear. Ea, who killed Apsu, cannot face Tiamat. Anu, the king of heaven, goes out to confront her but returns defeated, unable even to approach her. The gods are in despair. They will be destroyed. Their short existence will end. And then a champion emerges. Marduk, the son of Ea, young and powerful, skilled in magic, bearing weapons of storm and wind. But Marduk does not offer his services freely. He makes a demand. If he defeats Tiamat, if he saves the gods from annihilation, he must be made supreme. His word must be law. The council of gods must proclaim him king of all the gods with absolute authority. It's a power grab, a young god seizing the moment of crisis to elevate himself above all others, even above his elders. But the gods, desperate and afraid, agree. They grant Marduk supreme authority, and he goes forth to face Tiamat. The battle that follows is one of the most vivid and violent scenes in ancient literature. Marduk arms himself with weapons both conventional and space. A bow and arrow, a club, a net woven from the four winds. And he rides a storm chariot pulled by 4 terrible steeds, demons of weather, breathing fire and poison. He confronts Tiamat in single combat. The dragon goddess opens her mouth to devour him. But Marduk sends the evil wind, the storm, into her jaws. It inflates her body, distends her like a balloon. She cannot close her mouth. And while she is helpless, Marduk shoots an arrow down her throat, piercing her heart, killing her instantly. But Marduk's work is not finished. He captures the fleeing army of monsters. He strips the Tablet of Destinies from Kingu, and then he returns to Tiamat's massive corpse and performs an act that will define all of creation. He splits her body in half like a shellfish. From the upper half, he raises the dome of heaven, posting guards to ensure that Tiamat's waters do not escape. From the lower half, he spreads out the earth. He creates mountains from her breasts, causes rivers to flow from her eyes. He assigns stations to the gods, establishes the calendar, sets the sun, moon, and stars in their courses. Order is imposed upon chaos. The cosmos is born from the corpse of the original mother. This is the Enuma Elish. This is the Babylonian version of creation. But remember, this is not the original Sumerian story. This is a later adaptation, politicized to exalt Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, at the expense of the older Sumerian deities like Enlil. Earlier Sumerian versions likely had Enlil or Ninurta in the role of the dragon slayer. But the core narrative is the same. A space battle between the old order and the new, a terrible war in the heavens, the death of original beings, and the creation of the ordered world from the remnants of chaos. Now, here is where things become interesting from the perspective of those who seek a more literal interpretation of these writings. If we read this not as pure mythology, but as a distorted memory of actual events, what are we really looking at? We are looking at a catastrophic space war, a conflict between ancient powers and younger, more aggressive forces. A battle so violent it literally reshaped the structure of the solar system. And we are looking at the aftermath, the creation of a new world order built upon the corpse of what came before. Some researchers, following the interpretations popularized by Zecharia Sitchin in the 1970s, read the Enuma Elish as a description of actual astronomical events. In this interpretation, Tiamat is not a goddess, but a planet, a world that once existed between Mars and Jupiter. Apsu is the sun. The younger gods are the other planets in our solar system. And the story describes a space collision, a catastrophic impact that destroyed Tiamat, creating the asteroid belt from her shattered remains, and perhaps even affecting the orbits and conditions of other worlds in the solar system. In this reading, Marduk is not a god, but another planet, a massive interloper that entered our solar system from outside, perhaps on a long elliptical orbit. Its passage through the inner solar system brought it into collision with Tiamat, shattering the original world. Academic scholars reject this interpretation almost universally. They point out that Sitchin's translations are often inaccurate, that he imposes modern astronomical knowledge onto ancient poetic writings, and that there is no scientific evidence for such a collision or for the existence of a large planet on an unusual orbit. The mainstream view is clear. The Enuma Elish is mythology. It is a political and religious writing designed to justify Babylonian supremacy. It is not astronomy. But here is what cannot be denied. The Enuma Elish describes in vivid and specific detail a space catastrophe, a violent restructuring of the original order, a battle that resulted in the literal dismemberment of a space entity and the creation of the heavens and earth from the pieces. Whether we read this as myth or as distorted memory, the emotional and narrative truth is the same. Something terrible happened before creation as we know it. Something was destroyed, and from that destruction our world was born. So let us now ask the question that the writings hint at but never fully answer. Where were the Anunnaki during all of this? What world did they originally inhabit? The traditional academic answer is straightforward. The Anunnaki were created along with everything else. They emerged from the original chaos along with the rest of the gods. They have no prior home because there was no prior time or place. They are part of the creation myth itself, not separate entities that arrived from elsewhere. But a minority of researchers and a significant portion of popular belief proposes something different. They suggest that the Anunnaki were not created during the space restructuring described in the Enuma Elish. They were survivors of it. Or perhaps they were from another world entirely, a world that orbited the sun on a vastly different scale, and they came to Earth in the aftermath of the catastrophe, seeking a new home because their original world had been damaged or destroyed. This brings us to the most controversial element of the ancient astronaut theory, the concept of Nibiru. According to Sitchin's interpretation, Nibiru was the original home of the Anunnaki. It was the planet identified with Marduk in the Enuma Elish, and it orbits the sun not in a circular path like Earth, but in a vast, highly elliptical orbit that takes 3,600 years to complete. This 3,600-year number is crucial. It appears repeatedly in Sumerian writings. It is represented by the Sumerian word sar or shar, which denoted a large period of time. The Sumerian king list, that enigmatic document that lists pre-flood rulers with impossibly long reigns, uses multiples of 3,600 in its calculations. The Atrahasis epic specifically states that the Igigi gods labored for 3,600 years before rebelling. Could 3,600 years represent not just a symbolic large number, but an actual orbital period? Could it be that Nibiru, this hypothetical world, swings through the inner solar system every 3,600 years, close enough for travel between worlds to be possible, and then recedes back into the outer darkness for another long age? Mainstream astronomers are emphatic in their rejection of this idea. A planet with such an orbit, they argue, would be gravitationally unstable. It would disturb the orbits of other planets. It would be visible to amateur astronomers when it approached the inner solar system. No such planet has ever been detected. Furthermore, the very idea contradicts basic celestial mechanics. An orbit as extreme as Sitchin proposes, one that brings a planet from the deep outer solar system to within Earth's orbit, would require such specific conditions and would be so easily disrupted by gravitational interactions that it would likely not survive for more than a few orbits before being ejected from the solar system entirely. Yet, the believers persist. They point to ongoing searches for large objects in the outer solar system, to the discovery of dwarf planets like Sedna with strange elongated orbits, to the theoretical Planet 9 that some astronomers believe must exist to explain gravitational anomalies in the Kuiper belt. They note that throughout history, planets have been discovered by noting their gravitational effects before the planets themselves were seen. Uranus's orbit led to the discovery of Neptune. Neptune's orbit led to the search for Planet X. Could there still be something out there? Something massive? Something following an unusual path? Something the ancients knew about but we have lost? The debate continues, fierce and unresolved. But let us step back from the astronomical arguments and ask a different question. What does the mythology itself tell us about the Anunnaki's original world? Regardless of whether we interpret it literally or symbolically, the writings provide tantalizing hints. In Sumerian cosmology, the gods dwelt in multiple realms and resided in the highest heaven, a realm above even the visible sky. Enlil governed the earth and the atmosphere. Enki ruled the Abzu, the deep waters below. But there are references scattered throughout various writings to the gods having come from somewhere else originally, to their arrival from the place where the sun rises, to their descent from the heavens to establish cities on earth. One of the names given to the Anunnaki is particularly instructive. In some writings, they are called those who from heaven to earth came. This is not an academic translation. Scholars tend to translate Anunnaki as princely offspring. But the popular interpretation, based on a more literal reading of the syllables, yields those who from heaven came down. If we take this seriously, it suggests that the Anunnaki's original home was not Earth, not the Earth goddess Ki's domain, but somewhere in the heavens, in An's realm. They descended. They came from above. They arrived. Another clue comes from the detailed descriptions of the gods' dwellings. The writings describe the gods living in temples, in houses, in palaces. But these are not abstract spiritual dwellings. They are physical structures, complete with doors, walls, furnishings. The gods eat and drink. They sleep. They need rest. They experience physical exhaustion. They are described in remarkably corporeal terms for beings we are told are divine and immortal. The Atrahasis epic describes the Ijiji gods as becoming tired from their labor, as burning their tools, as surrounding Enlil's house. These are not disembodied spirits. These are physical beings engaged in physical work. If we entertain, just for a moment, the possibility that these writings preserve distorted memories of actual events, what picture emerges? We see a group of advanced beings, the Anunnaki, arriving on a world Earth. We see them engaging in a massive terraforming project, digging rivers, building mountains, preparing the landscape. We see their workers rebelling after precisely 3,600 years of labor. We see them making a decision to create a new species, humanity, to take over the work. And if we look back even further, to the space catastrophe described in the Enuma Elish, we see a possible reason for their arrival. A disaster, a space war, the destruction of an original world. Could it be that Nibiru, the Anunnaki's original home, was damaged in this space catastrophe? That its orbit was destabilized, perhaps thrown into the elongated path that believers describe? That the Anunnaki, facing the slow death of their world, made the decision to seek a new home? That they sent out expeditions during their world's periodic passage through the inner solar system, scouting for suitable planets? That they found Earth young and barren, but with the potential to support life? That they committed to a vast, multi-millennial project to prepare it for colonization? This narrative, purely speculative and rejected by mainstream science, nevertheless has a compelling internal logic. It explains the terraforming described in the Atrahasis. It explains the specific time period, 3,600 years. It explains why the gods would need to labor at all, why they would need to create humanity as helpers. They were not omnipotent space beings. They were refugees, colonists, survivors of a space catastrophe, trying to build a new home before their own world failed completely. Let us examine what the writings tell us about the nature of this original world, this Nibiru, if it existed as more than myth. What was it like? The name Nibiru itself is instructive. In Akkadian, the language of Babylon, Nibiru means crossing point or place of transition. It was associated with the planet Jupiter in most astronomical writings, specifically with Jupiter at a particular position in its orbit when it crossed the celestial equator. This has led many scholars to conclude that Nibiru was simply another name for Jupiter, not a separate planet at all. But Sitchin and his followers argue that the name crossing point is itself significant. A world that crosses, that transitions, that moves from one part of the solar system to another, would be a world on a highly elliptical orbit, a world that periodically crosses the established orbits of the other planets. Furthermore, some Mesopotamian writings assign Nibiru special significance. In some accounts, Nibiru is described as the Star of Marduk, the celestial body associated with Babylon's patron god. But more than that, it is described as a body that holds the crossing of heaven and earth, a space anchor point that maintains the order of the heavens. If we try to envision what such a world might have been like in its prime, we must turn to mythology and imagination, for the writings give us only fragments. But those fragments paint an interesting picture. We know from Sumerian mythology that the gods lived in a society remarkably similar to human civilization. They had hierarchies, the great gods ruled, the lesser gods served. They had families with all the drama and dysfunction that implies. Enlil and Enki were half-brothers, constantly in conflict. Inanna was ambitious and jealous, always trying to increase her power. The gods engaged in politics, formed alliances, waged wars, held councils. This suggests that Anunnaki society, if it existed, was structured, organized, hierarchical. It was not a paradise of enlightened beings living in perfect harmony. It was a complex civilization with rulers and subjects, with conflicts and compromises, with a rigid social order that distinguished between the elite Anunnaki and the worker-class Igigi. We also know that the Anunnaki were associated with advanced knowledge. Enki in particular was the keeper of the Mi, the divine decrees or principles that govern civilization. These Mi included everything from kingship and law to metalwork, writing, and agriculture. In myth, Enki possessed these Mi and guarded them carefully, and other gods would occasionally try to steal them or trick him into giving them away. What if the Mi represent not mystical principles, but actual knowledge, actual technologies? What if the Anunnaki civilization possessed advanced sciences that they brought with them from their original world? The writings describe Enki as possessing great wisdom, as being skilled in magic and craft. They describe the gods as building ships, as traveling through the heavens, as possessing weapons of terrible power. Marduk's weapons in the Enuma Elish include storms, winds, lightning, and a net that ensnares his enemy. Are these literal descriptions of advanced technology rendered in the only language available to Bronze Age scribes? We must also consider what might have gone wrong on Nibiru. What catastrophe might have driven the Anunnaki to Earth? The Enuma Elish, if read as space history, describes a violent impact, the destruction of Tiamat. If Nibiru was involved in this impact, if it was the body that struck Tiamat, then it too would have been affected. Celestial collisions are mutual, both bodies are damaged. Perhaps Nibiru's orbit was destabilized. Perhaps its atmosphere was damaged. Perhaps its ability to sustain life was compromised. The mythology of a dying world is not unique to Sumerian writings. Many cultures have flood myths, catastrophe myths, stories of worlds that end and are reborn. The biblical story of Noah's flood is directly paralleled in Mesopotamian writings like the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim survives a global deluge sent by the gods. Could these flood myths be memories not just of earthly disasters, but of a catastrophe that affected multiple worlds? Could the Anunnaki have experienced their own apocalypse before coming to Earth? One intriguing detail from Sitchin's interpretation specifically claims that the Anunnaki needed gold, vast quantities of gold, to repair their world's atmosphere. This claim has been widely ridiculed by scientists who point out that gold is chemically inert and would not form a protective atmospheric shield. But the detail persists, appearing in multiple retellings of the ancient astronaut narrative. Where did it come from? Sitchin claimed to derive it from his translations of Sumerian writings describing the Anunnaki mining operations. Mainstream scholars say no such writings exist describing gold mining specifically for atmospheric repair. Yet the writings do repeatedly associate the Anunnaki with gold, with precious metals, with underground mining operations. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the gods as possessing mountains of lapis lazuli and gold. The gods are adorned with gold. Their temples are filled with gold. The great treasures of the ancient world were dedicated to the gods' houses. Is it possible that Sitchin extrapolated from these general associations to create a more specific narrative about why gold was important? Or did he have access to translations and interpretations that mainstream scholars dismiss? The question remains unresolved. What we can say with certainty is that the Sumerian writings describe the Anunnaki as beings who were deeply involved with physical materials, with construction, with mining and metalwork, with the transformation of the natural world. They were not distant, ethereal spirits. They were hands-on, almost engineering in their approach to creation. If Nibiru existed, if it was the Anunnaki's original home, and if that world was failing, the decision to seek a new home would have been momentous. It would have required long-term planning. It would have required sending out expeditions, surveying candidate worlds, selecting the most promising one, and then committing to a multi-generational project to make it habitable. This brings us back to the 3,600 years of labor described in the Atrahasis. If Nibiru's orbital period is 3,600 years, then the Anunnaki would have only brief windows of opportunity, when their world passed through the inner solar system, to travel to Earth. They would arrive. They would work frantically during the years when travel was possible. And then they would have to leave again, or remain behind, knowing they would not see their home for another 3,600 years. This creates a poignant human dimension to the mythology. These would not be all-powerful gods effortlessly creating worlds. These would be exiles, separated from their home, working desperately to prepare a refuge, knowing that their civilization's survival depended on their success. After 3,600 years, one complete orbital cycle, the worker gods, the Ijiji, had reached their breaking point. They had given their entire period of service, and they rebelled. This led to the creation of humanity. But it also raises a disturbing question. If humans were created to be workers, to be slaves, what happened to the Anunnaki themselves? Why did they need human help at all? The writings suggest that the Anunnaki, despite their power, were limited. They could die. They could be exhausted. They needed sustenance. They aged, though slowly. They were not truly immortal in the absolute sense. They were perhaps simply very long-lived beings from a low-gravity world, or beings with access to advanced medical technology, or some combination of both. And if their numbers were limited, if they were a small expedition far from home, they would absolutely need help to complete the massive task of preparing an entire planet for habitation. The creation of humanity would not be a whim or a convenience. It would be a necessity, the survival plan, the final phase of a project that had already consumed millennia. Let us now turn to the most difficult and speculative question. Does any physical evidence support any part of this narrative? Are there any artifacts, any anomalies, any unexplained traces that might suggest the presence of an advanced non-human civilization in Earth's deep past? This is where we must tread most carefully, distinguishing between proven facts, intriguing mysteries, and pure speculation. The academic consensus is clear and unequivocal. There is no credible physical evidence for ancient aliens visiting Earth. There is no evidence for a planet Nibiru on an unusual orbit. There is no evidence that humans were genetically engineered by non-human intelligence. The development of human civilization can be fully explained by natural evolutionary and cultural processes. The fossil record shows a clear progression from earlier hominids to modern humans. The archaeological record shows gradual development of technology from simple stone tools to complex metallurgy. The genetic evidence shows that humans share common ancestry with other primates, with no indication of artificial modification or alien DNA sequences. However, there are mysteries, genuine mysteries that even mainstream archaeology struggles to fully explain. These mysteries do not prove the ancient astronaut theory, but they remind us that our understanding of the ancient world is incomplete, and that Bronze Age peoples were capable of far more than we often give them credit for. Take, for example, the sudden emergence of Sumerian civilization around 3200 BCE. The Sumerians appear in southern Mesopotamia with a fully developed writing system, advanced mathematics based on the number 60, sophisticated architecture including the first ziggurats, complex irrigation systems that transformed the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, and highly organized city-states with professional priesthoods, standing armies, and bureaucratic administration. Some argue this emergence was too sudden, too advanced to be purely indigenous development. They point to the lack of clear precursor cultures showing gradual evolution toward these achievements. They suggest it was the result of knowledge transfer from the Anunnaki, that the gods literally taught humans these skills as described in the myths. Mainstream scholars counter that the emergence was not actually sudden when examined closely. Archaeological evidence shows gradual development of urban centers in the Uruk period, building on earlier Ubaid culture that dates back to 6500 BCE. The Ubaid people already had sophisticated pottery, built temples on platforms, and established trade networks. The writing system began as simple pictographs used by temple accountants to track goods, gradually evolving over centuries into the full cuneiform script. The architecture developed incrementally from simple mud brick structures to increasingly elaborate temples and palaces. The mathematics emerged from practical needs, counting and dividing goods, measuring fields, calculating areas and volumes for construction projects. There was continuity, not sudden appearance. The ziggurat form itself evolved from earlier temple platforms, each generation building higher, closer to the heavens. Nevertheless, the Sumerians themselves claim their civilization was a gift from the gods. The writings explicitly state that kingship was lowered from heaven, that the gods taught humans agriculture, metalwork, writing, and law. The Sumerian king list begins with a formula that appears repeatedly throughout. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This phrase, descended from heaven, can be read as metaphor for divine legitimation, or it can be read literally as describing an actual transfer of authority and knowledge from beings who came from the sky. Another mystery concerns the astronomical knowledge of ancient peoples. The Sumerians possessed sophisticated mathematics based on the number 60, the sexagesimal system we still use for measuring time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These are Sumerian innovations that have persisted for 5,000 years because they are mathematically elegant and practically useful. But why base a number system on 60? Modern decimal systems use 10 because we have 10 fingers. The Sumerians had 10 fingers too. Why choose 60? Some mathematicians note that 60 is highly composite, divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60, making it extraordinarily useful for division and fractions. Others point to astronomical reasons. 360 is close to the number of days in a year, making it useful for tracking celestial cycles. The Sumerians tracked planetary movements with remarkable precision. They identified 5 visible planets: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, and assigned gods to each. They knew the orbital periods of these planets with accuracy that should have required centuries of careful observation. They understood the concept of the ecliptic, the path the sun appears to follow across the sky, and they divided it into 12 sections, creating the zodiac that we still use today. Most remarkably, they seem to have known about the precession of the equinoxes, a 25,920-year cycle caused by the slow wobble of Earth's rotational axis. This cycle cannot be detected in a single human lifetime or even in a single generation. It requires centuries of precise astronomical measurements, comparing star positions across long spans of time. How did Bronze Age people without telescopes or computers detect and measure a cycle that takes 26 millennia to complete? The academic answer is patient, multi-generational observation by dedicated priesthoods, combined with the excellent visibility of stars in the clear desert skies of Mesopotamia. Given enough time and careful record-keeping, the precession becomes detectable. The alternative answer is knowledge transfer from beings who either had access to better instruments, or who had lived long enough to directly observe the cycle, or who came from a culture old enough to have accumulated such knowledge. The debate continues, with both sides presenting reasonable arguments. We must also consider the remarkable similarities between creation myths across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. The flood story, for instance, appears not just in Mesopotamian writings and the Bible, but in myths from Greece, India, China, Mesoamerica, and indigenous cultures across the Americas, Australia, and Polynesia. The story of gods descending from heaven and teaching human civilization appears in Egyptian mythology with Thoth and Osiris, in Mesoamerican mythology with Quetzalcoatl and Viracocha, in Indian mythology with the Rishis and Devas, in Chinese mythology with the culture heroes who taught agriculture and writing. Are these similar myths because all human cultures share common psychological patterns, as Carl Jung's theory of archetypes would suggest? Are they cultural diffusion ideas spreading along ancient trade routes from a single origin point? Or are they independent cultural memories of actual events, of a time when advanced beings really did walk among humans and teach them the foundations of civilization? The mystery deepens when we consider how these myths sometimes preserve surprisingly accurate information. The Sumerian account of the solar system, for instance, as depicted on certain cylinder seals, seems to show awareness of all the planets, including Uranus and Neptune, which were not officially discovered until the 18th and 19th centuries with telescopes. Ancient astronaut theorists point to cylinder seal VA-243 as depicting the solar system with the Sun at the center, surrounded by 11 planetary bodies, supposedly showing knowledge impossible for ancient people. Mainstream scholars counter that the seal actually depicts a star surrounded by smaller stars or dots, a common decorative motif, and that the interpretation as a solar system map is wishful thinking, forcing modern knowledge onto ancient artwork. Similar debates rage over other anomalous artifacts and sites. The ancient site of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built around 9600 BCE by supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers, features massive carved stone pillars arranged in circles, sophisticated bas-relief carvings of animals and symbols, and evidence of complex social organization thousands of years before the invention of agriculture. How did Stone Age people accomplish this without metal tools, without written language, without the surplus food production that agriculture provides? Mainstream archaeology celebrates it as proof that humans are more creative and capable than previously thought, that complex societies can emerge before agriculture. Alternative researchers see it as evidence of lost advanced civilizations or ancient assistance from non-human sources. The truth, as always, lies in evidence carefully examined and theories rigorously tested. But the mysteries remain genuine, and they fuel continued speculation about humanity's deep past and the possible involvement of forces we do not yet understand. Nevertheless, the Sumerians themselves claimed their civilization was a gift from the gods. The writings explicitly state that kingship was lowered from heaven, that the gods taught humans agriculture, metalwork, writing, and law. The Sumerian king list begins, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." This is either mythology explaining natural processes, or it is a literal description of knowledge transfer from an outside source. Another mystery concerns the astronomical knowledge of ancient peoples. The Sumerians knew sophisticated mathematics based on the number 60, the sexagesimal system we still use for measuring time and angles. They tracked planetary movements with remarkable precision. They knew the precession of the equinoxes, a 25,920-year cycle that requires centuries of careful observation to detect. How did they acquire such knowledge? Natural observation over generations, say the scholars. They had clear desert skies, a priesthood dedicated to watching the heavens, and centuries to compile observations. Knowledge transfer from more advanced beings, say the alternative theorists. The Sumerians knew things they shouldn't have known without telescopes and modern instruments. The debate cannot be resolved with current evidence. We must also consider the mythology itself as evidence not of literal events, but of something profound in the human experience. Carl Jung would argue that these myths of gods descending from heaven, of a time before humanity, of creation through space violence, are archetypes, universal patterns in the human psyche. They recur across cultures not because aliens visited everyone, but because they reflect fundamental psychological truths about human consciousness, about our need for meaning, for origins, for connection to something greater than ourselves. Others argue that myths are distorted memories of real events, passed down through oral tradition for so long that the factual core has been obscured by poetic elaboration. The flood myths might remember actual catastrophic floods. The wars of the gods might remember actual wars between early human communities. The Anunnaki might remember a real founding group, perhaps migrants from another region who brought advanced knowledge, who were deified by later generations into gods. Still others maintain that the myths should be taken at face value, that our ancestors were not primitive and superstitious, that they recorded what they actually witnessed, and that we should have the humility to consider that they might have been telling the truth, even if that truth is difficult for us to accept. Perhaps the most honest answer is uncertainty. We do not know for certain what inspired these myths. We do not know if Nibiru ever existed as anything more than a name for Jupiter or a conceptual crossing point in the sky. We do not know if the Anunnaki were gods, aliens, ancient human rulers, or pure fiction. What we do know is that the Sumerian writings describe a cosmos far more complex and dramatic than we often imagine. They describe beings who were powerful but not omnipotent, who labored and struggled, who made mistakes and suffered consequences. They describe a creation that emerged not from perfection, but from violence, from chaos defeated but never fully destroyed. And they describe humanity's place in all of this as intentional. We were created for a purpose. We are not accidents of evolution or chance combinations of chemicals. In the Sumerian view, we are the result of deliberate action, of divine need, of a decision made in a space council chamber. Whether we take this literally or symbolically, it grants humanity profound significance. We matter. We were wanted. We have a role to play in the space drama. This is perhaps why the ancient astronaut theory continues to fascinate despite academic rejection. It offers something that modern scientific materialism often fails to provide: a sense of space purpose, a connection to something greater, a narrative in which humans are not insignificant specks on a random planet, but the created children of advanced beings, inheritors of a vast space history. But with that sense of purpose comes a shadow. For if we were created to be slaves, if we are the property of beings who might return to claim us, then our freedom, our autonomy, our very identity as independent beings is called into question. This darker implication is rarely emphasized by ancient astronaut enthusiasts, but it lurks in the writings themselves. The Atrahasis epic is clear. Humans were created specifically to bear the workload of the gods, to free the Anunnaki from toil. We are not cherished children. We are constructed tools. The writings describe Enki mixing clay with the blood of a slain god to create the first humans. There is something violent and utilitarian about this process. We are made from earth, from the flesh of the world itself, but also from divine blood, giving us intelligence enough to understand commands, but not enough to question our makers. The ultimate question the Sumerian writings force us to confront is this: what do we owe to our creators? If they exist, if the Anunnaki were real, if they genetically engineered humanity, if they gave us civilization and knowledge, but did so for their own purposes, to serve their own needs, do we owe them gratitude or resentment? Are we still bound to serve them if they return? Or have we, through our own efforts across thousands of years, earned our independence, our freedom to chart our own destiny? These are not idle philosophical questions. They cut to the heart of human identity, of our relationship with authority, with tradition, with the past. And they remain relevant even if we reject the literal truth of the ancient astronaut narrative. For we all, in a sense, are created beings. We are created by our parents, by our cultures, by our histories. We inherit DNA, language, customs, beliefs, systems of power that we did not choose. And we must decide what we owe to those who came before, how much we should honor tradition, and how much we should forge our own path. The Sumerian writings, in their descriptions of gods and creation, human slavery and divine conflict, give us a mythological framework for thinking through these eternal questions. Perhaps that is their real value, not as literal history or scientific treatise, but as profound philosophical and psychological exploration of the human condition. Let us now draw together the threads of this vast narrative. What do the Sumerian writings reveal about what happened before the Anunnaki came to Earth? They reveal a cosmos born from chaos, from the original sea, from the undifferentiated void. They reveal the emergence of first principles, sky and earth, the fundamental division that makes existence possible. They reveal a space family, generations of gods, each more differentiated and specific than the last, from the original parents to the gods of specific domains. Wind, water, sun, moon, love, war. They reveal conflict, the inevitable tension between old and new, between the original chaos that wants to preserve its ancient rest and the younger forces that bring noise, activity, and change. They reveal a great war in the heavens, a battle between Tiamat, the original mother turned monster, and Marduk, the champion of the younger gods, a war that ends with the creation of the cosmos from the corpse of chaos. They reveal the Anunnaki as the victors of this conflict, the royal family of the gods, established in positions of space authority, assigned to manage different aspects of creation. They reveal the beginning of a vast labor, the Igigi gods working for 3,600 years to prepare the world, to dig rivers and build mountains, to make the earth suitable for life. They reveal a revolt, a labor crisis that threatens the entire project, resolved by the creation of a new species designed to bear the workload. And they reveal the complex, fraught relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity, creators and created, masters and servants, gods and mortals bound together in a space drama neither can escape. Whether we interpret these writings as literal history, as mythology, as distorted memory, or as philosophical allegory, their power is undeniable. They force us to ask the biggest questions. Where do we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone in the cosmos? What is our relationship to the forces that created us? Whether we call those forces gods, aliens, evolution, or simple chance. The academic world has largely dismissed the ancient astronaut interpretation of these writings as pseudoscience, as wishful thinking by people who cannot accept that ancient humans were capable of great achievements without supernatural or extraterrestrial help. And in many ways, the academics are right. The translations that support the ancient astronaut theory are often questionable. The archaeological evidence for alien contact is non-existent. The astronomical evidence for Nibiru has not materialized despite decades of searching. And yet the mystery persists. The writings continue to fascinate, and new generations continue to wonder if there might be some kernel of truth, some fragment of actual memory hidden within the mythology. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Perhaps the Anunnaki were not literal aliens from another planet, but they were also not pure fiction. Perhaps they were an advanced human civilization that predated the Sumerians, a lost culture destroyed in a catastrophe whose survivors brought knowledge to the early Mesopotamians and were remembered as gods. Perhaps Nibiru was not a planet, but a space event, a passing comet or asteroid that ancient peoples witnessed and incorporated into their mythology. Perhaps the 3,600-year cycle refers not to an orbital period, but to some other recurring phenomenon, solar cycles or climate patterns or cultural upheavals. Or perhaps we should simply acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. The Sumerians lived 5,000 years ago. Their oldest myths were already ancient to them, passed down through oral tradition from an even earlier time. We are trying to reconstruct events, if they were events at all, that occurred thousands of years before the oldest writings were written. It is remarkable that we have any information at all. It is hubris to think we can reconstruct with certainty what happened in those distant days. As you drift here in the darkness, the story of the Anunnaki's lost home world, their space war, their arrival on Earth, their creation of humanity. All of this swirls around you like the original waters of Namu. You cannot grasp it entirely. It is too vast, too strange, too distant. But you can feel its power, its pull, its insistence that you take it seriously, that you do not dismiss it out of hand. The Sumerian scribes who pressed these words into clay 4,000 years ago believed they were recording truth. They believed they were preserving the most important knowledge their culture possessed, the story of how everything began. They wrote it down not as entertainment, but as sacred history, as the foundational narrative upon which their entire civilization was built. And for 1,000 years, New scribes copied these writings, preserving them, passing them down, ensuring they would not be lost. That alone suggests these stories mattered profoundly. Whether they are mythology or history or something in between, they carried meaning, truth of a kind we may have lost the ability to fully comprehend. In our modern world of science and technology, we tend to divide things into categories. Fact or fiction, real or imaginary, true or false. But ancient peoples thought differently. For them, a myth could be true even if it never literally happened. It could convey truth about the nature of reality, the structure of the cosmos, the relationship between humans and the divine. The Sumerian creation myths give us a cosmos that is fundamentally dramatic. Creation is not a peaceful unfolding, but a violent struggle. Order emerges from chaos not inevitably, but through conflict, through the courage of heroes, through the defeat of monsters. The world we inhabit is not eternal and unchanging. It was made. It has a history, could end. This is a worldview both terrifying and empowering. Terrifying because it means our existence is contingent, dependent on forces we do not fully control. Empowering because it means we are part of something meaningful, something that was fought for, that was wanted, that has purpose. And in that ancient story of the Anunnaki beings who descended from the heavens, who labored to transform a world, who created humanity in their image but for their own purposes, we find a mirror. We see ourselves. We are the Anunnaki now, shaping our world with technology, manipulating genetics, reaching for the stars. We are beginning to develop the capability to travel to other planets, to establish colonies, to transform Mars or the Moon or distant exoplanets to make them habitable. In 1,000 years or 10,000, will our descendants be the Anunnaki to whatever life forms they encounter, whether they find them or create them? Will they be remembered as gods by the civilizations they establish? Will future archaeologists on distant worlds puzzle over the writings and artifacts we leave behind, trying to reconstruct what happened before their creators arrived? This recursive nature of the myth, the way it looks both backward to our origins and forward to our potential future, is perhaps its deepest power. The Sumerian writings do not give us a simple origin story. They give us a template, a pattern, a way of thinking about creation, about work, about the relationship between creators and created, about the cycles of rise and fall that seem to govern all civilizations. Whether the Anunnaki were real or imagined, whether Nibiru orbits in the darkness or exists only in myth, the story they tell is our story. It is the story of beings trying to survive, to build, to create, to leave something lasting behind. It is the story of workers who rebel when the burden becomes too great, of rulers who must adapt or face overthrow. It is the story of violence that leads to creation, of chaos that is shaped into order, of the old giving way to the new. These patterns repeat throughout human history because they are fundamental to existence itself. The Sumerians understood this. They encoded it in their myths. And those myths have survived because they still speak to something deep within us, something that recognizes truth even when we cannot verify facts. So we are left with mystery. The Sumerian writings reveal that before the Anunnaki came to Earth, there was chaos, there was space war, there was a decision made in a divine council to embark on a great work. They reveal that the Anunnaki themselves have a history, an origin, a homeland, whether that homeland was a distant planet, or the heaven of mythology, or simply the earlier phases of Mesopotamian culture that predated the historical period. They reveal that humanity's creation was not an act of pure benevolence, but a solution to a practical problem, a way to sustain a civilization that could not sustain itself. And they reveal that our relationship with our creators, whoever or whatever they are, is complex, necessary, sometimes oppressive, always significant. These writings do not give us certainty. They give us something better. They give us a lens through which to examine our own existence, our own origins, our own purpose. They give us permission to ask the biggest questions and to accept that the answers might be strange, might be uncomfortable, might challenge everything we think we know. And they give us a story worth contemplating, worth preserving, worth passing down to future generations who will face their own mysteries, their own questions about who they are and where they came from. The Anunnaki's lost home world, whether it was Nibiru or Tiamat or the original chaos itself, remains lost. We cannot visit it. We cannot prove it existed. but in the writings preserved on clay tablets in the ruins of ancient cities. In the wedge-shaped marks pressed into mud 4,000 years ago, we have something precious. We have the story. We have the memory, however distorted by time. We have the first attempts by human beings to answer the question that still haunts us today. What happened before? Where did we come from? What lost world? What space catastrophe? What divine decision set in motion the chain of events that led to us here now asking these questions? The Sumerian writings give us an answer. Not a simple answer, not a provable answer, but a profound answer. Before the Anunnaki came to Earth, there was chaos, and there was war, and there was loss. There was a world or a state of being that could not continue, that had to be transformed or abandoned. There was a decision made, a commitment undertaken, a future chosen over a past that could not be preserved. And from that decision, from that space drama, we emerged. Created or evolved, designed or accidental, slaves or free beings, we are here. We are the inheritors of whatever happened in those distant days before recorded history, before cities, before even the gods themselves were born from the original void. And that is where the story must end. Not with certainty, but with awe. Not with proof, but with possibility. Not with answers, but with better questions. The mystery of what happened before the Anunnaki came to Earth will likely never be fully solved. But it will always be worth contemplating, because in trying to understand their origin, we come to better understand our own. We come to appreciate the vast depths of time, the space scale of existence, the improbable chain of events, whether divine or natural or some combination of both, that had to occur for us to be here. As you open your eyes now, returning to the present, to your room, to the soft glow of screens and the comfort of the familiar modern world, carry this with you. Somewhere in the vast expanse of space and time, on clay tablets in museum collections, in the ruins of ancient cities, in the forgotten memories encoded in the oldest myths, there is a story about beings who came from the heavens and made us what we are. Whether that story is literally true, or metaphorically profound, or simply a beautiful fiction created by people trying to make sense of their world, it remains powerful. It remains haunting. It remains, in its own way, true. For truth, in the end, is not just about facts and evidence. Truth is about meaning, about the stories that help us understand who we are and why we matter. And the Sumerian writings, with their tales of space wars and descending gods, of lost home worlds and created servants, of the Anunnaki and their 3,600-year cycles, give us a story that grants existence itself dramatic significance. We are not accidents. We are not meaningless. We are part of a vast space narrative that stretches back to the beginning of time and forward to an unknowable future. We are the created beings who became creators, the servants who became masters of their own destiny, the children of the Anunnaki, whether they were gods or aliens, or simply our own ancestors remembered through the distorting lens of mythology. And that story, that profound and troubling and magnificent story, is our inheritance from the oldest civilization on Earth, preserved in the world's first written words, waiting for anyone brave enough to read them and ask what they truly mean. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time, through myth, through the vast mysteries of ancient Sumer. If you found value in this exploration, please consider sharing it, liking it, subscribing to continue these deep dives into the forgotten corners of our past. Let me know in the comments what you think. Do you believe the Anunnaki were real? Do you think Nibiru exists? Or do you see these writings as pure mythology, beautiful stories with no basis in physical reality? The discussion, like the mystery itself, continues. And in that continuation, in our ongoing questioning and wondering and searching, we honor the Sumerian scribes who first asked these questions 6,000 years ago and preserved their answers for us to discover. Sleep well and dream of ancient cities, of gods descending from heaven, of a lost home world somewhere in the darkness between the stars. For in those dreams, we touch something eternal, something that transcends time and space and connects us to the deepest mysteries of existence itself. Until next time.